got an echo.
You're tuned into the hottest paranormal life show on YouTube, Into the Fringe, where we discuss lost civilizations, UFOs, cryptids, unsolved mysteries, megalithic structures, extraterrestrials, interdimensional portals, time skips, and more. Don't change that channel, because now you are leaving the mainstream and entering into the fringe.
Hello, followers. It is I, your host, Cardinal, and with me today is my expert co-host, Mexican Ironman. How are you today, sir?
Very well, sir. Super excited about the show. Super excited about the guests that we have. I still having a hard problem getting these alien nanonites. Like, they apparently have now genetically fused with my DNA, and I no longer resemble the Mexican I once was. I think I'm going to be Mexican alien man forever now. It's sad. It's
That is very sad. I was hoping you'd be able to clean your suit out at some point, but apparently not. I guess we're just going to have to live with it.
Yeah, well, I don't know. We're going to need to do, advanced research technology here to scrub these suckers out of here.
You think we're going to have to get DARPA involved?
Yeah, let's get DARPA involved.
That'll work. That'll probably
that'll work. We're gonna need someone from the still unknown secret space program.
That's right. The secret, and I'm kind of disappointed because I was really looking forward to talking with Micah about the secret space program. I got a fax in my video toaster that he wasn't going to be able to make it today.
Wait, what?
Yeah, my video toaster just spit out a fax, and he was like, "I can't make it."
Oh no!
Yeah,
but you.
I know, right?
This isn't fair. I shine my armor and everything.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan.
I'm a bigger fan of his than you are.
I don't know about that, but
I have listened to him like hours upon hours. The only podcast I've listened to more than, I would say, maybe Coast to Coast.
Yeah, I stopped listening to Coast a long time ago.
It's more of a charity stream now. Oop, did I say that out loud? Did I just call it a charity stream now?
I like that, but you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that was something I was looking forward to.
Perhaps I can broadcast through the alien nanonites in my DNA, and I can send out a message to the universe to have him delivered back onto the Cardinal Sin network.
Let's give that a shot. Calling Micah Hanks. Calling Micah Hanks. Hey, there he is.
And the next thing I knew, this guy looks me right in the eye and who are you?
Hey.
What's this?
Happy April Fool's Day, everybody.
Where did the pretty girl I was talking to go to? Now I have to deal with you too.
Now it's just us guys.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Great.
So Micah Hanks is a writer, podcaster, researcher, and speaker whose interests cover a variety of subjects, including history, archaeology, science, and the future of humankind. A longtime researcher and proponent of the scientific study of unidentified aerial phenomena, or UFOs, Micah has authored a number of books and contributed many essays, articles, and blogs to various publications. Along with his podcast, he's also worked as a narrator, lending his voice to several audiobooks, radio programs, and other recorded projects over the years. His books include Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule, The Complete Guide to Maverick Podcasting, The Ghost Rockets, Mystery Missiles and Phantom Projectiles in Our Skies, The UFO Singularity, Why and How Are Past Unexplained Phenomena Changing Our Future, Will Transcending the Bounds of Current Thinking Lead, How Near is the Singularity? Boy, that's a mouthful. And Reynolds Mansion, An Invitation to the Past, The History and Strange Happenings at a Southern Antebellum Home. Welcome, Micah Hanks, to Inside the Fringe.
Well, it is certainly good to be here. I couldn't think of a more appropriate date than April Fool's Day. And a quick note also about that incredibly lengthy title of that UFO book. I didn't pick that. That was one that my publishers insisted on. No joke.
I was going to say, you really like those subtitles, don't you?
That wasn't the subtitle I picked. But, they had a big meeting about that. And, it took a week. And then they got back with me and said, we have this great idea, So, hey, there you go. There it is. History, right?
Hey, it's a book, right? So,
yeah, there's something to be said about working with publishers, but one of the interesting things about publishing these days is that more and more people are even, doing it. And by that I mean like well-known authors, established novelists. They're self-publishing just because A, they can, B, they can go directly to their audience, and they cut out the middleman essentially. Yep. And these days the technology exists that it can be done very easily. So, it's very popular to do. So I say, why not just self-publish, right?
Yep. That's true.
And with your background, it's just amazing, like audiobooks, to do your own book. I don't know, you probably have the time for that type of stuff, but, any future works that you might do would be great to get on audiobooks, with your voice. Yep. Because, some of the material that I think that you cover, I just don't think that, a hired gun might do it justice. There's just so many nuances with how you approach the subject matter, which I'm just really excited that you're here. I think, you're one of the few people that we can have a really broad and in-depth discussion with about a variety of topics. And I really see you as being literally, if there were a bunch of freeways of all aspects of ufology and everything, you're the only one that really applies a scientific approach. And you're so open. I think one time I heard yourself on a podcast call yourself the optimistic skeptic or something like that.
Hopeful skeptic.
Hopeful skeptic or something like that. And it's just, your mind is so open to so many possibilities, but you absolutely draw a hard line at the ridiculous.
Yeah, that way I know where I am when I step over into the ridiculous myself.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know when that is, but well, Cardinal, where do we start? What topics are we going to cover?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say, hey, Micah, my friend, it's so good to see you. Boy, this has been a long time coming, and I'm really excited to have you on. Thanks so much for being on Into the Fringe.
Oh, no, it is my pleasure. And you're right. We have talked about in various incarnations, catching up and doing an interview like this for, probably years. So this actually has quite a bit of history behind it. And I'm really thrilled to be here because, again, like you guys are talking about there, I have a lot of interests. I know you do too. And your program covers a lot of different interests, which also happen to be my interests. But
yeah, it's really interesting. And I have to say, I'm such a fan of your work as a writer, an investigator on so many subjects. You're not just an armchair researcher. You get out there in the field and you really know your casework, and you literally get your hands dirty. You and I have a lot in common. I was a professional musician for 25 years. I'm a writer, and I've been interested in UFOs and the paranormal since I was a little kid. And as Mexican Alien Man was saying earlier, I'm a bit of a fanboy. I don't mind admitting. I kind of fashioned my approach after yours in a way. So I'm really a bit in awe of how you do so many podcasts a week and still find time for writing. And you really have made this into a job. You probably just didn't realize it was going to be a 60 to 80 hour a week job, right?
I don't think I realized it would be a job at first. I mean, so back up to musician, right?
Mm-hmm.
About 10 years ago, I was actually just transitioning out of working professionally in radio. And I had already been doing music on the side, but I'd begun playing at that time with a two-time national champion banjo player. And I say banjo, and everybody thinks, the Ballad of Jed Clampett. But I mean, Charles Wood is truly one of the most remarkable musicians that I've ever known. And I always tell people, if you want to see a wonderful showcase of his abilities, look up the YouTube video of him with Steve Martin on the David Letterman show.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he went on the David Letterman show with Steve Martin. They did Foggy Mountain Breakdown, but I mean, when Charles and I play together, we often do a lot of classical songs and things. And yes, he's playing all that on 5-string banjo, me on a Martin acoustic. So long story short, we started performing together a lot, and that was my job. We were musicians. But on the side, just for fun, because I'd worked in radio and I've always loved radio, I started doing the podcasts actually as live streams right about the same time really that Joe Rogan did, and his career just took off, and mine is still taking off. We're still on the runway taxiing, but no, in truth, I mean it just started for fun, and 10 years later, 4 podcasts, going all at once, several book projects behind me, and 2, maybe 3 or 4 more on down the road. I've always got a lot of projects, but I mean, I'm in the middle of research phase for several right now.
And you work with the Mysterious Universe, and it's just, it's crazy. I don't know where you find the energy. I know that like me, you have difficulty sleeping. I've been on the same sleeping pills for like 20 years, but I know that you have what did you call it? A dimorphous sleep schedule.
Oh, maybe a biphasic. Yeah,
biphasic. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go to sleep in 2 kind of bursts at night. Usually wake up sometime in the middle of the night. Sometimes I can go right back to sleep, but if it's going to be one of those nights where I'm up for several hours, I have learned just to use that time for research because it's quiet. I always keep my computer off. Don't blast my eyes with blue light during those wee hours, but that's when I do my reading. Mm-hmm. And that's some of my most productive research time really is in the middle of the night like that. But I mean, there was a study, actually several now, that have come out over the years that do strongly suggest, based on accounts that are found in numerous different historical references dating back several centuries,
like diaries and so forth.
Yeah, people talked about the second sleep, and it seems very likely that this is a pattern that many, if not most, humans have maintained for a long time, which really kind of makes you wonder what changed about modern society that you're supposed to eat this many meals per day.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to go to sleep at night, sleep all the way through the night, get up the next day, go and work that job. I mean, think of all the conventions that we call normal. Most of those are fairly recent inventions as far as deep time.
I always figured it was electricity, that
Probably.
At nighttime people can basically do whatever they would do during the day before electricity was common, so people can read, and they can now of course they can get online and play games or whatever. So I'm actually kind of a night owl myself, which is one of the reasons why I start the show at dinner time, which makes it difficult for some guests. But I did want to let you know, Micah, our audience is an intermediate to expert level one. So please don't mind if we skip over, Roswell 101, Project Book, the Condon Report. Our audience is sophisticated enough that they know most of the basics, so we can feel free to cover sort of the higher level things.
We're not going to talk about them things that fell in the desert on that summer's day in New Mexico
on July 4th. No.
Man, and the funny thing is that I've got the Roswell newspapers behind me.
I saw those.
Yeah, that's great.
I initially just intended to read those verbatim for you guys.
That's right.
But we'll talk about other stuff if we must. So,
well, and speaking of it, you've interviewed so many people that are either firsthand witnesses or researchers to the very best cases across the spectrum. You can be forgiven for having reached conclusions because you've actually examined the evidence. Are you still a hopeful skeptic?
I'll always be a hopeful skeptic in the sense that I don't ascribe belief to really anything. And I'll tell you where a lot of that comes from. I mean, we could say that the philosophical roots of that idea go back to the original skeptics, right? Or the Puranists. But, and I think that, another guy that runs in our circles and a dear friend of mine, Greg Bishop, he and I have always identified on that kind of wavelength but really it was John Keel who I first read and who said it best in my opinion: belief is the enemy. As soon as you draw conclusions about certain phenomena, it's not to say that we can't make determinations and we can't draw conclusions if there's enough evidence. With topics like what is commonly known in North America as Sasquatch, but which I see as a much more worldly potential phenomena with relevance to paleoanthropology, and I prefer the term relict hominoid, that really popularized by Jeffrey Melderman in recent years, but a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists for years now have used that terminology, and historians. A topic like that, I think I could come closer to saying, if this exists, that's what I think it is. UFOs, on the other hand, it's a real trick and it confuses a lot of folks. But my approach is almost in that kind of Zen manner of no-mindedness. I study, I observe, but I try not to think as much about what it might be or to try and draw conclusions. So it's a weird kind of a process of analyzing without trying to necessarily draw a conclusion. It's
kind of an agnosticism.
Well, yeah, and that's because there are distinctive limitations to how well that phenomena can be observed. And again, there are so many different possibilities as far as what UFOs might be, but really we could narrow down maybe the most likely potentials. But then you've got the warring factions in those different camps that are insistent on their view. I've found it much better to kind of back off, not try and fall into one of those camps, and just observe and analyze without making the conclusion. So that's where skepticism comes into it, Gil. I'm always Cardinal, by the way. But
Gil's fine.
Yeah. I mean, for me, there has to be that kind of skepticism, that kind of hold it at arm's distance, but that way it's far enough that you see the big picture. But I also acknowledge there's a phenomenon. It should be studied, and I'm interested in these phenomenon. And in so much as I believe that there appears to be a phenomenon worthy of study, you could call me a believer or an advocate, but I don't believe in the pet theories that people project onto or anthropomorphize when they analyze these things.
Speaking of which, I wanted to ask you, what is the UFO singularity?
That was a funny kind of a concept. That short book, which I prefer to call an essay, really, it's an essay, long essay length book. I had years ago been working on a lengthy book, which really I put it aside only for the reason that I now look at trying to establish the history of the phenomenon as being the thing that maybe is the most useful that a researcher like me could do. More on that in a moment. But at the time I was working on a concept for a real broad ranging, book that around 2011 or 2012 would look at, the whole range of the UFO spectrum, maybe, and trying to analyze all of its constituent parts. There was going to be one chapter in this book where I tried to analyze UFOs within the context of the idea popularized, I guess, in the Matrix films a few years ago, where, for instance, conventionally, we would think that UFOs are spacecraft of some kind because they fly through the air, and they certainly aren't our airplanes or don't appear to be. Therefore, we presume that they might come from space. Actually, there's surprisingly little data in support of that idea, but let's roll with that for a moment.
Okay.
So if they come from space, and therefore they are spacecraft and they are probably piloted, then these are space people and therefore, extraterrestrials. I mean, that's the general mode of thinking when it comes to UFOs.
The ETH.
Yes, exactly. The extraterrestrial hypothesis. But there are plenty of other interpretations. I don't know that they're necessarily any more likely. In fact, I think most scientists who really look at the nuts and bolts possibility, they say if this isn't our own somehow, then it must be theirs, and whatever theirs is, but we could loosely categorize that as extraterrestrial or really maybe alien.
Cryptoterrestrials.
Right. Well, see, that's another hypothesis. If we go down the list, another is the idea that what if UFOs, kind of like in the video game The Sims, we can play a Sims game and they're running around. If we live in a simulation and we are like in the Matrix film, we're living in a simulated reality.
Mm-hmm.
One hypothesis might be that when the operators intersect with or interact with the Sims or their environment, the Matrix itself, that's what they appear like to us, which is not unlike, and in fact, I think that general concept was certainly borrowed and hinted at in the Matrix films with, Agent Smith and the agents appearing like traditional men in black.
Mr. Anderson.
Oh, I mean, it seems very, in fact, there's a striking resemblance with your glasses there, but I mean,
But don't feed his ego that way.
but I mean, the idea that, and personally, I don't know that I ascribe to that idea that we live in a simulation, but I am interested in a couple of things. How many conventional scientists that would downplay any discussion of UFOs, and even as popular as the subject has become in recent years, many of them, I'll give an example, Elon Musk, still do. Elon, you'll see him tweeting things like, trust me, if Earth were being visited or if there were phenomena like this, I would know about it. And I'm like, well, that's a rather presumptuous statement.
Yeah, it is.
And yet, on the other hand, he also is very much of the mind that this, base reality could be a simulation. And I'm like, well, I wish I could just talk to Elon Musk.
So is Neil deGrasse Tyson. In fact, he said it was likely because if there's a base reality and we have a civilization that is, more advanced than we are by, say, 1,000 years, they'll probably have a very realistic, immersive AI with conscious characters, etc. And how many of those are there? And you have the top down society, which is the base society, the base incarnation, if you will, and then they create a simulation, and they create a simulation. And so Neil deGrasse Tyson was saying it's much more likely than not that we do live in a simulation.
Yeah, and there is some mathematical justification for that idea. But again, although it is speculative, where I go with this is I take it one step further. And again, let me be clear. This is not what I believe. This is one model in which we might attempt to explain some UFO-like phenomena. That's all it is. But I would further offer to Neil and to Elon and people who have been traditionally very skeptical of UFOs, but they're all in on an equally unprovable idea that may have at least some mathematical justification, but we're a good ways from proving it. Guys, if we are living in a simulation, as Werner Vinge had talked about when he was outlining this idea in Omni magazine way back in the day, talking about really what we call the technological singularity, really a simplified definition that Werner gave years later was that the singularity will be at one point when we all wake up and things in our reality are going to seem really strange and out of place. And I always like that definition because I'm thinking, gosh, that sounds a lot like what we already observe with UFOs, is it not? So again, the idea of operators outside the matrix intersecting with it, maybe taking on the form of quote unquote Sims in their own right. We don't directly interact with them, but we observe phenomena that we can't account for. That's one model that could be used to try and kind of frame the debate. But I don't know if it's any.
And would that be the model you'd apply towards, say, these Tic Tac videos from the last few years?
It could be applied. It could be applied.
I think it could be applied.
It could be applied. Again, I think that the favored model, strangely, with the Tic Tac things, seems to be our own technology, some sort of a special technology. Yet again, I mean, there is some evidence that justifies that notion. Now, my personal feeling is, though, that, and now, I'll get this feedback from people from time to time. They're like, giving you a 1-star review on Apple Podcasts, Hanks, because while you talk incessantly about UFOs, you fail to recognize that the Navy already has this technology and can make these things. And I'm like, well, first of all, the guy who actually has done the most work, I mean, more than anyone, reporting now for a couple of years on those Navy patents that describe UFO-like, technologies developed by Salvatore Pais, is Brett Tingley. Brett Tingley lives an hour that way. We meet up frequently. We play music together. We go hiking. We enjoy beer, and I love to hang out with his, family and his kids and his wife, and wonderful people.
Asheville has some great microbrew pubs, huh?
some great microbrews and some great researchers and writers incidentally too. But the thing is that Brett, he has led the charge on that research. I'm well aware of that hypothesis. I think that Brett's sort of agnostic toward it as well, although he certainly acknowledges that is likely. But again, to the point, could the simulation hypothesis apply to the Tic Tac? Again, all of these things are speculations at the current time. I would say as far as, top secret technologies the Navy's been developing, there are a lot of problems with that theory as well. However, more likely it may seem to any researcher. And we have to remember that we don't have enough data that conclusively proves that as being their source either. So again, at times I like to try and acknowledge different hypotheses, but the one thing that really I think that we must acknowledge and which we must accept about this more broadly has to do with the history of the phenomenon. For those who say, look, the Navy are building these things, it's our own stuff, and I don't have any time for this UFO stuff because now we know the Navy can do it, I would say, but could they do it in 1973 when we had a tremendous sightings wave where there were a lot of oblong, or cigar-shaped objects, not unlike what, Commander David Fravor says he saw, and what Chad Underwood, the pilot who filmed it with the Raytheon targeting pod at FLIR system, what he actually appears to have caught on film. Do we have that technology in 73? 63 for that matter? Did we have it in 1943 when pilots during the war were first reporting strange things that they were seeing in the skies, not only over Europe, later over the Pacific Theater, and even right here over the United States? So if the Navy has had that even prior to the establishment of the U.S. Air Force, I mean, we've got a real mystery on our hands, in my opinion. That's even more mysterious than the prospect that there is something far more exotic in our skies that we simply haven't identified yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to kind of segue from that to, I assume that your book, The Ghost Rockets, had to do with the cases in Sweden in the early 1950s after the war, but it's more than that. Can you go into some detail about what are ghost rockets?
Certainly. 1946 over Scandinavia, especially Sweden, we certainly did have a lot of sightings of what at the time were described as rockets. Now, although the objects were actually described as being rocket-like, one of the problems with that interpretation of them as being rockets is that A, there was no material shrapnel ever found. And in some instances, these objects actually crashed into lakes, and yet still there was no wreckage recovered. I mean, they literally had splashed water out of the lakes, and when investigators would arrive, some of them actually military, because the Swedish military became involved in the investigation. They were very concerned about the potential for there being actual rockets being fired from someplace, possibly German captured technology being tested, long-range missiles being tested by the Soviets at the time. So the military arrives at the lake, and there's algae and sea plant, or rather water plants, that have been splashed up onto the shore. Something crashed into the lake, and they still find no evidence of whatever the object or technology, if that's what it was, had actually, where it had actually gone. So those cases were really interesting. But at the same time, and actually the case that I opened that book with, because you're right, Cardinal, the sum total of the material covered in that book, it looks at rocket or missile-like objects seen throughout history and really right on up to the present day. But starting in 1946, the case I actually lead the book off with did not occur in Scandinavia. It was a 1946 observation right here over the United States. Captain Jack Puckett with Strategic Air Command was flying south to MacDill Air Force Base in the early morning. I think he was in a C-17, if memory serves. I'd have to double check the aircraft. But as he's flying along, a large, again, roughly, kind of rocket-shaped object. He said it looked a lot like a B-17 bomber, but without wings, and that the fuselage was like roughly double the size of a traditional bomber. So this incredible long cigar-shaped object with no wings, producing smoke and red flame out the back, comes flying at him and his aircraft, narrowly misses, and heads on, and they estimate it's moving he and his crew at about 1,000 miles an hour. Now, again, that's the summer before Kenneth Arnold, ladies and gents.
Huh.
And again, in 1948, the famous Charles and Whitted encounter seems to describe a very similar object, which, again, there was a corroborative sighting from the ground on the same night in question. This was, of course, one of the sightings that was key in the issuance of the so-called estimate of the situation by the newly formed U.S. Air Force under its Project Sign, a predecessor to Blue Book at that time. So I was intrigued by those early cases in UFO history that describe something almost like large rocket ships, literally almost like Buck Rogers type rocket ships that were being seen even before Kenneth Arnold. And there were certainly things being described like rockets seen over Scandinavia. But yeah, I go throughout the years and look at similar cases. There was a flurry of sightings of rocket-like objects that were rising up out of Long Island Sound in the middle 1990s. I had not intended to cover TWA Flight 800 in that book whatsoever, but in investigating the description given by some of the witnesses, namely a gentleman by the name of, I believe his name was Paul Angelides. He had been walking along on the coastline and had observed the explosion in midair. The official explanation, of course, of the crash had been a center wing fuel tank, like a spark had emitted within the center wing fuel tank, and it brought the plane down.
Yep.
Angelides had said he observed something rising up out of Long Island Sound moving toward the aircraft.
Wow.
And he wasn't the only witness who thought that they saw that. And in fact, some of those reports were actually included in the National Transportation Safety Board's actual official report, which they later said, but we think that those observers were mistaken. There was a group of researchers called the Association for Retired Aviation Professionals that began investigating this incident because they were very concerned about some of these witness testimonies involving what appeared to be an object moving toward the aircraft. And sure as hell, they do find that a number of eyewitnesses not only said that they saw one on the night of the TWA Flight 800 incident, but that there had been other sightings of rockets or missile-like objects. Again, that's what the observers compared them to. And these have been seen in the months before and even in the weeks after that incident. And so, again, I was kind of, fascinated by the number of rocket and missile type incidents that have been reported over the years. And then recently, writing for the debrief.org, I had done a pretty intense, lengthy article looking at pilot encounters with UFOs that I've mined over the years from NASA's aviation safety reporting system. Some of them are extremely weird and more traditional UFO type cases. I saw at least one observation of a saucer that some pilots reported in there, but not surprisingly, a number of reports I've found within the aviation safety reporting system as well describe pilot observations of what appear to be missiles, rockets, torpedo-shaped objects that have flown dangerously close to their aircraft, even maybe as recently as the last 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's really what that book's about. And I wouldn't, say that the ghost rockets that were seen over Scandinavia only happened in 1946. And just as a kind of addenda to all that, I recently caught up with the ghost rocket investigator, Klaus Svan from Sweden. He is just one of the very
And you
best.
had him on when it was the Grayling report, right?
Well, no, actually, just in recent weeks, I had him on.
Okay.
That's right. And of course,
On the Micah Hanks program.
Yeah. Yeah, he jumped on. It was the first time we ever finally got to catch up and talk. He'd read my book. I'd read a bunch of his. But
I actually caught that show.
Yeah. And so you heard, Klaus said, I still get reports from right here in Sweden of very much, just like the ghost rocket reports from the 40s. So it seems like it's still happening there to this day.
Very strange.
Yeah.
We had Philip Mantle and Jason Gleaves on last week, and we touched on Calvin Parker's new work going back to his abduction in Pascagoula. That one's a pretty solid CE3 case. What are your thoughts on the Pascagoula abduction case?
Yeah, it is hard to, discount that one for a number of reasons. First of all, it occurred right there toward the end of, I believe, in October of 1973. Which happened to coincide with a sightings wave that had been going on throughout that year, but really seemed to have kind of focused on the latter part of 1973. When Hickson and Parker described this object, yet again, and I try to be careful not to project the idea of the modern tic-tac observed during the 2004 Nimitz incident back onto all the UFO sightings from over the years. But we may, again, while being careful about that, we also must acknowledge, I think, the prevalence of what traditionally were described as, usually more like cigar-shaped or egg-shaped craft. Again, in the Hickson and Parker incident, they described a egg-shaped or football-shaped object, which comes down, descends low over the these kind of swampy area there by the Pascagoula River where they're fishing. Most probably know the story, but in terms of my feelings about it, yeah, it's hard to discount that one. Now, something that's really interesting about it that I've observed is the fact that with some abduction cases, I'm fascinated with the abduction phenomenon. listeners of my show and you guys will probably notice I don't talk about it all that much on my own
Mhm.
podcast, but I certainly maintain a private interest in it. But I'm not sure what it represents. And by that, what I mean is, for instance, I recently read Whitley Strieber's, and I'm going to make a quick point, and then we'll come back to Pascagoula.
Sure.
But I recently read Whitley Strieber's book, A New World. I've met Whitley a couple of times. He actually had me on his show years ago, and so we've actually spoken at length one time. Very nice guy. But the book fascinated me not because it's like, wow, listen to these incredible encounters with aliens. In A New World, I went into it yet again with my very hopeful skeptic, but open-minded, expectations. Let's hear him out and hear what he has to say. It sounds so much to me like his recent experiences in recent years, and even his interpretation now of things from earlier in his life, they sound to me more akin to like a religious experience.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. I mean, he's talking about one of his recent contact experiences, and I'd really love to talk with Whitley about this. It'd be a great conversation, I think. He describes seeing this sort of shadow moving across the floor toward his feet and everything, and that he kind of moves his eyes or something, and it causes this object to kind of pop up into the air. And he says it takes on the form that he recognizes as the vesica piscis. Okay. Yet again, a symbol that is really actually, if you think of it in terms of the intersection between two spheres, the area where the two spheres converge and have a fish-like shape.
Right.
That vesica piscis, of course, has traditionally also been featured in with, especially Christian religious iconography and whatnot.
And he's a religious guy.
And he's now writing a book about Jesus too.
Really?
Yeah. And I'm like, this really does sound to me a whole lot more like a sort of interesting religious experience. And you think about Philip K. Dick's religious experience that he had. Have you guys heard that story?
Oh, yeah.
He had
the starseed transmissions.
Yeah, I mean, where what was it, like a person I think had been wearing a fish-shaped necklace, and like sunlight, reflects off of it and catches his eye, and all of a sudden he has this prophetic sort of vision. I mean, it's incredible. So this sort of dovetails with some of the research of Professor David Halperin, who really views the UFO experience as a religious experience. A lot of people get turned off by that because they want to look at the UFOs as a nuts and bolts kind of phenomenon. We can't deny the religious component. There's some aspect to it. Who knows what that is? But coming back to Pascagoula, what's really interesting about that case to me, and yes, again, we have a physical nuts and bolts craft that appears to come down. They say that they're taking aboard this thing, examined. The really interesting thing is the recording that's made later that night that they don't know is being made by the sheriff.
Exactly.
And they're not putting on. I mean, if they were acting, they were acting with no one else in the room, and they had no knowledge of anybody knowing that they were acting. So, I mean, I find it to be very compelling. But in the years later, Hickson began to, go on the lecture circuit and do interviews and things, which I'm personally fine with. A lot of people are like, aha, see, got him. Yeah, he's out there with his extraordinary claims now doing the lecture circuit and doing appearances.
Well, when people like that, have experiences like that and they're reported, people ask them questions all the time. So you might as well write a book.
Well, you might as well write a book,
answer the questions,
and do the events, and do the radio shows and things. I don't personally, again, this comes back to the whole thing about, did I start going, I'm going to get famous or make money doing something with UFOs? No, I'm interested in the subject, and I like to talk to people about it, and I feel like I have my own perspectives, so I like to talk about it too, and I research and read about it all the time. So why not do shows, rather than sitting and looking in the mirror or boring my family members to death talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But coming back to Pascagoula, you see that very same sort of thing later when Hickson starts going around and he's giving these lectures, and he's kind of working the popular lecture circuit. And again, with light of everything we've already said, I don't fault him at all for becoming a frequent appearance at UFO events at the time. And I found it quite interesting how often he would say that he had had ongoing experiences and that he'd had telepathic communication with these beings and that they were very friendly. It takes on, yet again, those kind of religious overtones. Now, while Hickson was pretty outspoken about it, Parker was a little more reclusive for a number of years, but now
very much so. Yeah.
Recently, he's kind of come out more than ever before, really. I think it took him a long time to come to terms with it, but Parker too now describes very almost religious kind of sounding interpretations of not only the original event but also the continuation of whatever the phenomena might have been.
And he also strikes me as a religious guy,
Yeah,
So a lot of it, I think, has to do with, the psychology of the witness, their bias, that kind of thing.
sure. And again, I don't want to try and sound like I'm saying, oh, all of this alien abduction stuff can simply be explained as people having religious experiences. I mean, maybe some of them are, but also it could be that some people are literally abducted by flesh and blood intelligence from other places.
Yeah.
And the human psyche over time, especially as it's trying to cope with that and trying to resolve the high strangeness of that experience. I mean, it could be that they over time begin to project religiosity onto it. I mean, I don't know
Mhm.
what that is, but I'm saying that we can't ignore that aspect of it.
I
Right.
agree with you completely. I think there's been, one of our previous shows we talked about how, with one of the guests, we talked about how some folks almost take it, the whole benevolent alien, this is like angels, and we don't know what this is, or if anything, we really don't know anything, and to bring some really crazy biases to that experience. I mean, I just think that's insane. I think the only way to approach things is the way that you do. We have to approach it from observation, fact, and kind of stop there and really draw lines in the sand about what we have evidence for, testimony for, and so forth. I do think that one of our contemporaries, I think Richard Dolan does a good job of that. I think he does a good job of documenting what can be documented and then drawing lines as if you almost like ripples away from the rock that we would throw in the pond in terms of what might be believable or not. And I think that's really important because I think so much of this, the field, I've always been baffled by two things. I've always been baffled by how in this field, so many people seem to gravitate towards little, almost like the Tocqueville, into little groups, little political silos
Little
of what they
cliques.
believe, little cliques and groups of what they believe about one thing or the other, And then the other thing that's always been fascinating me, you were talking about this a few moments ago, is that every 7 to 15 years, it seems like the sightings take on there's a new ship shape that seems to be the most popular in sightings. Every 7 to 15 years, it seems like there's a morph into this new. Now everybody's seeing this shape right now. Now everybody's seeing that shape right now, and certain shapes just aren't seen as much. Like for example, like the classic 1950s, hubcap saucer type. No, when's the last time anyone saw one of those? I think that also is absolutely fascinating, and I think that speaks to the human psychosis as well. Because how is it that this generation sees this ship and this other generation isn't seeing that ship? But because some of the people there, got coverage just in Life magazine or whatnot, maybe now all of a sudden other people are seeing that ship. How do you respond to that, Mr.
Well,
Hanks?
I think one approach to resolving that, and this is certain to make everybody really angry, so let's go ahead and let's get controversial.
Let's
But
knock that
Let's
one
do
out
it.
of the
Let's
park,
do
yeah.
it. Throw the Mexican alien man out there. Let's do it.
and by the way, I love the armor. You got to tell me where I can get some of that. But
You don't want the nano bites that are in there because
I hear the
he can't clean the alien DNA out.
Yeah, it kind of gets under your skin, I hear.
Yeah. Well put.
If we were to think of ufology or UFOs or people's perception of them in a couple of ways, one is a form of myth. Now, I want to talk about that because it's a very loaded expression that really gets people angry. And two, if we think about the relationship of language to UFOs, I do think that the phenomenon you're describing there is a little more easily explained. Again, the phenomenon we're trying to tackle is, why does the shape appear to change every few years? And everybody thinks that UFOs are this, and then they're suddenly this, and then they're this. Now, a lot of ways that people have tried to interpret it in the past look at things like, what if these are different groups of aliens that are visiting Earth, and that this first group arrives and they're in flying saucers, and then years later they arrive in their giant cigars, and then the Tic Tacs arrive in the early 2000s, and each one are successive waves of explorers coming to Earth. Others, interpret it different ways. We could run down the list, but in my personal opinion, UFOs, and to be clear, I think that there's a physical, tangible phenomena behind UFOs. And frankly, the best descriptions that people give of that phenomena describe to me what sound very much like technology, maybe like analyses performed by the U.S. Air Force and other agencies from over the years. It's not anything that extends necessarily beyond what our physics understands, but it certainly seems to be a technology that can operate in ways far more advanced than our current understanding of physics and technology. Now, if we look at it in terms of it being a technology, it'd be awful hard to say that it doesn't exist. So why would I call it a mythology? The reason why is because mythology really is people observing things and then telling stories about it. And again, we have not captured a UFO and put one in a laboratory yet. Back in 1965 in Anatomy of a Phenomenon.
Not that we know of, anyway.
Aha, yes, not that we know of. Again, we could maybe suppose that
it's classified.
Right. And somebody or someone or some agency, some group does have one. The general public hasn't had the opportunity to study it. And I'm going to tell you really quickly, brief side on that. I talk frequently with a lot of members of the scientific community and even, NASA employees and people about this. And a couple of scientists recently said to me, if we have these things, the scientific community needs to know about it so that they can be studied. And this technology can't just be held away from the public. So, I mean, a lot of very non-crazy, serious, disciplined, qualified, credentialed scientists are also looking at that aspect of it. Yes, crash record retrievals possibly being obtained by government. But anyway, coming back to the point, as humans aren't able to study these things, whether it's scientists at NASA, or scientists at, Stanford University, or scientists at my local community college, or maybe it's a hobby scientist who tries to build flying saucers.
Skunk Works or whoever, yeah.
Whoever it is, since we can't study a UFO, what happens is when people see them, we go, my gosh, we saw this thing and it was sort of shaped like this. And man, and as you begin to notice, often the high profile UFO cases, the ones that get the most attention in the media, they do change slightly over time. Kenneth Arnold initially said he'd seen these chevron-shaped objects, but within months after the press starts calling them what? Flying saucers?
Because they looked like they were saucers skipping over the water.
He described their locomotion, not their shape, but within a few months, you can read the interviews, and he says, at least one of them was chevron-shaped, but the others might have been discs. So even
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, Arnold even actually updated some of his descriptions of the objects over time. I would further argue that Hickson and Parker's original, initial, seemingly nuts and bolts experience seemed to have layers of what you might call an almost kind of pseudo-religious alien brotherhood kind of mythos that began to be kind of layered onto it.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that as humans tend to try and observe something and then they try to analyze and explain and they add layers of interpretation onto it, I do think, and studies show that humans update their memory. I think that a mythology gets built around UFOs. But how that is helped along is by the language we use to describe them. Again, maybe there's no better example than Kenneth Arnold. Kenneth Arnold said he saw these objects and he thought that they were probably special, aircraft being developed, by our military. But when he says, it's like if you took a stone and you flick it and it skips across, the water like, skips like a saucer. The press jumps all over that. Now, researcher Chris Albeck has pointed out that doing his deep dives into newspaper research, the expression flying saucer had actually been used before Kenneth Arnold, but not in relation. Yeah, but not in relation to UFOs. Wing shooters who were practicing with clay, what I would know here is,
clay pigeons. Pull.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pull. So pull, bam, and then they go. Yeah, so
skeet shooting.
I thought the Mountaineer was. I thought Kenneth was the first one to use that. He wasn't then, or
the expression flying saucer appeared in print several times prior to Kenneth Arnold, but not in relation to unidentified flying objects.
In relation to the skeet shooting.
So you're okay. He was the first to. Well, actually, again, it wasn't his expression.
It was the reporters.
The reporters use it, but yeah, that expression flying. And so my suspicion, and I don't know if this is what Albeck thinks. Albeck spotted that, but my suspicion about that is that one of these reporters had been familiar with the expression flying saucer, and they applied that to, based on Arnold's description, the phenomena he was describing. But because that became the common term that was described, when people saw these objects, what were they described as? Saucers, right? And Ruppelt early on, as the first director of Project Blue Book, Edward Ruppelt, he noticed, okay, well, we call them flying saucers, but a lot of the objects people describe, they aren't disc-shaped. So he introduces this intentionally ambiguous phraseology, unidentified flying object. Never, ever probably would have guessed that would have, caught on. And I've had people correct me when I have referred to that as an acronym. They're like, but Micah, UFO isn't an acronym. That's an abbreviation. As it was originally intended by Ruppelt, he said it's to be pronounced UFO, which would have been an acronym. So anyway, that's ufology. Thus, ufology, exactly. And in different parts of the world, especially the UK, they do tend to still favor the pronunciation. At least British UFO researchers I communicate with, they usually do say UFO. It sounds funny to us here in the States, but I mean, that's what Ruppelt said to call it. So anyway, I think that we see that the flying saucer meme shows how language ends up being kind of projected onto as a descriptor, the mythology that begins to be built onto people's sightings. And yeah, many people did describe seeing discs, and even J. Allen Hynek in his classification system had daylight discs, but he'd tell you, but that's just a rough category. It doesn't apply to only disc-shaped objects, you see. Now, with 2004 and the Nimitz incident thing, with Fravor saying he sees a tic-tac, as some researchers have pointed out, I've noticed this myself, and hence why I said earlier, we can't just go back and now and try and retrofit every UFO to being a tic-tac. I definitely think that there are some objects that certainly match that criteria, but a lot of people are trying to look back through history and find ways to now find every UFO as being a tic-tac. So again, we're kind of seeing the same thing right now after Dave Fravor maybe unintentionally popularized that expression in relation to UFOs. So what will the next thing be?
There just are so many different aerial phenomena. In the videos, even the three Navy ones are, I mean, okay, maybe two of them are Tic Tacs, I guess, but one of them is absolutely more of a classic flying saucer type. It's goes up on the side and kind of tilts against against the I guess the whatever the wind pattern was at the time. I mean, I just find it absolutely fascinating how, as time has gone by since the 40s, there just seems to be more and more different types of shapes appearing, and it seems like each decade has right now. What would be like more lately? We have the triangle. There's been more sightings of this triangular, slow moving shape thingy, whatever it is, hovering quietly thingy. I mean, there's been more, that's been incredibly prevalent. Not a lot of footage, certainly nothing clear, but a whole heck of a lot of testimonials, in the last, say, 10, 15
anecdotal
years.
evidence, as they say.
And that, I think, is my favorite kind of UFO to study, the big black triangles. The reason being, I have collected more reports of sightings of those things. David Marler, who's done tremendous work on that in that field. David's a very, very good friend of mine. And, he and I will catch up and compare notes. But, I mean, it's very hard to convince me that, for instance, one of the landmark cases that David was there on the ground investigating shortly after it happened, the St. Clair County UFO incident from 2000 in January, where we had the Millstadt Police Department and also other departments in southern Illinois all responding in the wee hours of the morning to sightings of an object.
There are like 5 different agencies, right? Police and sheriff, right?
We've got all of these law enforcement officers who say that they saw this thing. Now, what's really interesting...
Now, is this the one that was traveling and one officer was in his car and then had to stop at the county line, and the next, officer was following it, and it went like 5 counties?
Yeah, it followed a very unusual path where it would zigzag and it would move around. I mean, it was the strangest pattern, but again, Marler and others have managed to track the path that the thing took based on, because you got to keep in mind, the police officers who were observing it, they were in contact with radio dispatch and describing it in real time.
And dispatch from one was contacting another.
That's right. And they had also called Scott Air Force Base on the night in question to ask if there was any kind of aircraft in the sky. They were communicating with everybody that they could, emergency management and whoever in the county. Now, what's really interesting to me about that case is that the police dispatch recordings were released thereafter, and you can hear the officers, Ed Barton being one of them, describing in real time. Yeah, it looks like a great big triangle. There appear to be 3 lights on it. It's moving really slow right now. But they would say that at times it would move, I mean, snail speed, and then take off really fast and move in these jumps. I seem to recall a description, which I don't know if one of the officers had actually given this description himself. I think it was, though. I seem to recall him describing it like a water bug. If you've seen a water bug, how they move across.
Glide across.
Yeah, they move across like that, and they'll move in little jumps. He said when they said the thing would accelerate to its kind of maximum speed. Again, no sound produced by this object, but it would move very much like that, and they likened it to a water bug gliding across the surface of a pond. So, but the there have been skeptics, and I've communicated with a few of them about this case.
But before you say that, though, before you get into the skeptics side of things, what I found interesting is, if I recall correctly, there were only, gosh, was it 10 or fewer people that saw it, and I think half or more of them were cops, one way or the other.
Half or more.
Good point. Good point.
There were a few others that came forward, but and again, this is to the point about the skeptics. The skeptics I've communicated with, I'll name one of them because I respect him a lot, and I like some of his. I mean, I like the fact that he does research, and I agree with a lot of what he does, but I also disagree with some of his conclusions. It's Brian Dunning of Skeptoid. Brian has reached out to me about some cases that he's looked at, and I've had a different opinion about, and he said, such and such brought to my attention that you found some things. Could you supply that information? We try to help each other out. I appreciate that. It's not
Sure.
this. Let's lob grenades. He's like, hey, have you got more information, something that I missed? Show it to me, And if I've missed something, he's, going to tell me too. So I appreciate that. But in Brian's investigation into that case, he had said that his conclusion was that the American Airship Company, and I believe this was based on a phone call that he made, and they said that they thought it was likely one of their aircraft. That the American Airship Company might have been giving a VIP tour that night. Now, the problem with that conclusion, though, for me, is that A, why was a VIP tour being given at like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah.
B, where are the flight log records that conclusively prove that that's what the aircraft was?
Transponder signal.
Yes. C, why did, if there was an aircraft operating that night, Scott Air Force Base said that they couldn't find anything in the sky that night?
Well, we all know that you can't trust what the Air Force says.
Right. Yeah. 4, okay, point D, when all the police officers in real time on the police dispatch recordings that were released and made publicly available described seeing a triangular object, which virtually all but one described. Okay, how could they have all mistaken a conventional blimp for a large triangle-shaped object? One of the police officers literally was standing as the thing nearly moved over the top of him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, to me, there's more than enough data to strongly suggest that there was an anomalous kind of aircraft in the air that night. And so with respect to Brian, again, he made a phone call to the American Airship Company, but I would say to the American Airship Company, if it was one of theirs, they need to provide the data that shows that that's what that was, and they need to help us.
And how did the propulsion work for it to be going so fast and differently than a blimp? And that brings me to my next question. With these big black triangular craft, ours or theirs, the TR-3B Belgium flap, do you think that these might fall into the category of alien reproduction vehicles?
I couldn't tell you. I have no idea what they are. I've looked into that.
Wait, which model are you talking about, Gil?
The TR-3B, the ones that flew over Belgium in, was it 1991 or 1993?
Yeah, in the early 90s, there was a series of sightings over Belgium. And again, most people often refer to the military intercept attempts where they're scrambled to try and get up there and find those. Talking with Dr. David Clark recently, again, who takes a more skeptical approach, he had said that, and this is true, the pilots, when they get up there to try and find these objects, they're having a hard time trying to find them. They couldn't find them. But what's also interesting about that time period is that when those sightings were occurring, there were a lot of sightings prior to the military intercept attempts where law enforcement officers had said that they observed large triangle aircraft hovering in the sky for a fairly long period. There were a number of different sightings over a period of time that comprised the Belgian UFO wave, and that was one of the earliest triangle waves of sightings that occurred. Now, the thing about those objects, putting this into the bigger picture, I've spoken to people who, where I live in Western North Carolina, say that they've seen those things fly almost over my neighborhood, but this would have been years before I lived here. I've spoken to a pilot.
They must have been attracted to the bunker.
It could have been. It could have been that. We could only speculate, but I've talked with, there was a gentleman who had been a steward on an aircraft in the 1990s, and on a morning flight, a transatlantic flight, they had observed, he and many of the passengers and the pilots all saw one of these things flying below their altitude over the Atlantic Ocean in broad daylight. I've spoken to people in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in the United States. I've spoken to U.S. citizens who were in China who observed one of these. I've talked to people who have seen these things at least
all over the world,
at least since the late 1980s. If they are just U.S., stealth aircraft, why are they flying in the airspace of countries far and wide. I mean, something about this does not make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it again leaves us with more questions than answers. So again, to your question about could these be some sort of alien kind of, vehicles? I don't know. I don't know what they are, but they're to suppose that they're just ours still leaves us with a lot of questions.
That's true. And that segues into my next question really well. Greg Bishop's co-creation hypothesis is gaining ground among UFO researchers, and both you and Greg contributed to Robbie Graham's book, UFOs Reframing the Debate on the subject. And the book is called A Cold Hard Slap in the Face for Ufology, a call to break away from established ideas, approaches, and practices, and to boldly tread a new path in a quest of understanding what may very well be the greatest mystery of all. And it definitely explores the realm of confirmation bias. If you're a believer, you see UFOs, and if you're a debunker, you don't. And I'm curious to see where you stand on the co-creation hypothesis. And can you tell us a little bit about your contribution to that book?
Well, sure. First of all, I want to say that Robbie Graham, of course, did a remarkable job, pulling everybody together for that. And Greg Bishop was really, even behind the scenes, instrumental in making that thing happen. We're having beer years after it's all published, and I remember the original essay that I'd submitted for that was a different topic altogether. And Robbie had gotten back with me and said, Micah, would you maybe want to try something a little different for this? And I said, sure, I could do that. And so the essay that ended up appearing in print is a completely different kind of a thing, where I'm looking at here's maybe how science can be applied better to these things, at least in my own opinion. Here is a new updated classification system rather than going with the time-tested and true J. Allen Hynek. I mean, I loved Hynek's work, but I mean, yet again, we already illustrated one of the issues with his, which he acknowledged, okay, not picking on Hynek, but he acknowledged the fact that the daylight discs, they aren't all discs. So again, maybe we can, use slightly more ambiguous phraseology so that we aren't projecting things onto the UFOs.
Something I was going to say earlier is what William S. Burroughs said and was popularized by Laurie Anderson. Language is a virus.
Well, it is. And again, Dawkins talking about the meme. A lot of people don't know this, but that concept of the meme first introduced by Richard Dawkins.
Mm-hmm.
What we're talking about is, viral language, and the way that when people latch onto a term, it begins to shape the way we think about things. Now, that really starts bringing us into the area of the co-creation hypothesis. But backing up again to Greg Bishop and my own contribution to that anthology, we meet later, years later, for beer, and I remember recalling how, it's funny, guys, I had actually written a different essay for that book, and Greg's like, I know, because I told Robbie your other one sucked. And I'm like, really? And he says, yes. He says, I read that first thing, and he says, I told Robbie, I gave him some honest feedback. I said, Micah can do better. I'm so thankful for guys like Greg, and people who are both polite and also really brutally honest.
Yeah.
Who, hey, look, here's what you should be writing, So I have to thank Greg also for my contribution to that, because had Greg not intervened, what I put in print wouldn't have probably been as good as what ended up in the anthology. But again, coming back to the whole idea of viral language and the way that, the language virus, being applied to anything.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, really plays a component in the sort of idea that Greg proposes and the sort of co-creation hypothesis. The idea also that, if you believe in these things, then here's what you're going to see if a UFO shows up. If you're a skeptic, you're going to make another excuse. You're going to call it something else. Again, let's use the 2004 Nimitz incident as a sort of example, because that really has, in recent days, for me, become a great one. I have for years seen skeptics say, look, we aren't doubters just for the sake of not wanting to believe. We just aren't compelled by the flimsy evidence that UFO researchers bring to the table. Show us some good evidence, and we'll be the very first one to say that there's a real there. Okay, so then the Navy videos are released, and then authorized versions are acknowledged and released officially by the DoD last fall. And we've still got skeptics saying that if we dangle a peanut on monofilament and shine a flashlight behind it and film the shadow of that on the wall in our garage, and it looks sort of like what we see in that film, then
that must be what it is.
And that is incorrect.
Right.
Because you didn't use the most advanced targeting system and program, okay, and technology really.
Our ability to measure a thing as it gets better, the thing changes.
Certainly, yes. Well, yeah, if we want to get into the double slit experiment, I mean, observing it causes it to change. But I mean, in my opinion, again, coming back to the whole idea of the explanations that are being offered for the things in the Navy videos, I don't know what those are. And in the image that we see right there, actually, that from I believe the gimbal footage, I think. I always get them mixed up. Gimbal Go Fast and
That's correct. This is a gimbal.
Yeah. Mark D'Antonio, who, of course, has worked as chief image analyst for MUFON, but also is a fine astronomer in his own right, pal of mine for years, and we were talking about that particular footage. And in Mark's opinion, you can hear the pilot in the actual video through the kind of static in the background. He's saying, "Look, dude, it's like it's rotating." Mm-hmm. Mark thinks that what's rotating is actually the lens on the targeting pod, which may be what accounts for the apparent shift in motion of the object as it's flying, but the pilot does acknowledge it. Then again, what the pilot is seeing is what he's observing through the targeting pod, and he too may have misinterpreted that as the object rotating. Mark thinks that,
but the background stays the same.
Correct. Right. Exactly. Which is why I think Mark believes that light or perhaps reflection given off by the object might actually, as the rotation of this, and again, Mark can explain this far better than me, but as the rotation of this lens occurs, it's the light reflection that causes the object to appear to shift in motion. Now, with regard to the other footage, the FLIR footage, that to me, and actually at one point when it actually zooms in and you can see the actual tic-tac shape of the thing, I don't look at that and think 747 in the distance. And again, with all respect to Mick West, because Mick has really been the one that has led the charge saying that this is probably a conventional aircraft. I find one problem with his description, which leads to other problems, and that is simply this. If it's a far distant aircraft and Underwood was filming something in the distance and it's distorted and you can't really make it out, if it's far enough in the distance, okay, maybe. But the problem is that Mick has since on the Metabunk forum had to, update his analysis and say that the aircraft appeared to have been much closer to the camera at that time. Now, given that circumstance, okay, if we're talking about an aircraft maybe 19 miles distant, if they're capable of tracking them on radar, they should also be able to detect its transponder. And if this were any conventional civilian commercial aircraft, it should be readily and easily identifiable. And yet it apparently was not. The objects that were described both during the intercept attempt by Commander Fravor and then also by Chad Underwood appeared not to be detectable on radar, and also appeared not to possess any transponders. Now, again, another skeptical point, which is a fair one, is, well, this could be just drug runners, dude. I've had people say, drug runners, brah.
Sure.
Guys, if we have people who are flying without transponders in aircraft that they can't detect easily on radar, although the objects at times were detected on radar.
Must be some good drugs, man.
Well, it must be good drugs, and it also must be really good drugs because they're flying through controlled airspace during military exercises with the Nimitz carrier group, guys.
Them there are what I would call some technologically advanced Mexicans.
Well, look, I'm going to tell you something. If it's really just drug running, that in itself is a tremendous problem. But Chad Underwood, during an interview that he gave to Jeremy Corbell, a phone interview, Chad Underwood said, whatever this thing was doing out there in that airspace at that time while we were trying to intercept it represents an act of war. Mm-hmm. Well, again, with all respect to the skeptics, because I think that their interpretations are very important, even if I disagree with their assessment. And I think that these conjectures, need to be raised. But I think that we also need to keep that in mind, what Underwood and others said about what the presence of an object in that airspace at that distance at that time actually entailed. Maybe the simple explanations are not so simple as they seem, because they actually raise a whole lot more questions about national security and other issues that we potentially are facing, even if we're just talking about drug runners out there off the California coast, you see.
Yeah, which is, again, I think really a reach. So, Micah, by now, we absolutely know for a fact that despite 70 years of denials, governments do have an ongoing interest in UFOs, not just the U.S. government, but those of Canada, the UK, Japan, China, Russia, etc. What do you think the government's interest in UFOs is? And let's touch on the Pentagon and the U.S. secret studies.
Well, I would suspect that their interest has to do with identifying a broad range of potential threats to national security, aerospace technologies potentially operated by U.S. enemies or rival nations. If we want to use slightly more militaristically correct language, I don't know. I think that they are far less concerned about whether or not there is an intelligence. I think it is if there's a technology, if it's operating in our airspace, if it can outfox our fighter jets, it's potentially therefore a threat, and therefore it must be analyzed and studied, and the threat potential must be assessed.
And one thing, that I will give Stephen Greer is his attitude or idea or way of going that, when ATIP and these other organizations are named and they have threat in the title as part of the anagram, that, that's really doing a disservice to the phenomenon itself, that because these things have, since the modern UFO era started, violated, controlled airspace, the Capitol building in 1952, et cetera, all the way to modern day and Tic Tacs. It's, I think a misnomer to talk about them as threats. They're curious. They've penetrated, the like Malmstrom Air Force Base and many, many others that were strategic air command bases. They were curious about the weapons storage area, the nuclear weapons storage area of, in Bent Waters, just all over. And so I can understand why the military would think of them as a threat. But I think that it's not only counterproductive to do so, but if you recall, when they had orders to shoot them down, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. That didn't work out so well. So trying to apply the way that we think, especially how the military thinks about these kind of things, to whatever the phenomenon is, I think, not just counterproductive, but dangerous.
Potentially, yeah. But I also think that when we see advanced aerospace threat identification program and whatnot, again, what that says to me is that they aren't just looking at UFOs. This is a program that looks at a wide range of things, some of which may actually be threats, but which UFOs, because they're unidentified aerospace technologies, or seemingly so, those fall into that category, you see. So again, I think you're right. There is no evidence that I know of that strongly suggests a threat that has ever been indicated or actioned, by these craft. We might say that there are some anecdotal stories that, where people have been injured by them. In most cases, however, and frankly, Elizondo says this too, what interaction I've had with Lou, and I actually want to try and reach out to him soon and have a more lengthy on the record conversation. Because,
and when you do, please remember to mention Into the Fringe to him, because he's somebody that we'd like to get on.
Well, the thing is recently he's been doing a lot more interviews. I've spoken with Lou off the record a few times. Great guy, fantastic guy. But, now that he's doing more interviews and everything, and his schedule sort of changed a little, I'd like to maybe, get him down, pin him down for a lengthy talk about some of this. One of the things that he's talked about to me, though, privately, and I've also heard him speak about with others, is that many instances where injury seems to have resulted from a observation of or a near observation or interaction with UAP tends to seemingly be a byproduct of what we would maybe perceive as being non-ionizing radiation. Presumably, if these aircraft have some sort of nuclear propulsion system, and this is nothing, by the way, that's special or new to ATIP. For instance, Jacques Vallée, I think, was talking about non-ionizing radiation possibly playing a role, at least as far back as the early 1990s in some of his writings.
Even earlier than that.
Yeah, probably. We certainly, though, had cases that predate that. If we go back to, Rendlesham, there was, that was implied about Rendlesham. It was even more strongly implied about a phenomenon that occurred within like a 48-hour period there of the famous Rendlesham incident, and that was the Cash Landrum incident in Dayton, Texas, 1980. Betty Cash was suffering from what seemed obviously to be the onset of acute radiation sickness within maybe 24 hours of having stood out there in the road looking at this thing that's producing so much light. The heat that it was giving off made that December evening feel like it was, a summer day. So there's a strong implication there that these aircraft may not intentionally harm people, but they are capable of causing injury. And this is something that a lot of researchers have looked into over the years. All that to say, though, you could say that there is a threat potential that exists there, but I don't think it's an intentional threat, right? And so yet again, we have to make the distinction between when we say threat in relation to these aircraft, what is it that the military is actually looking at? Okay, that they deem a threat under which UFOs may fall, that greater umbrella. And also, is that threat necessarily intentional? So I could say certainly that there are some instances where the threat is present and people have been injured, but I don't see an intention behind that injury with UAP, right? Now, coming back to what the government, studies in the Pentagon with your original question there, Gil, I have long kind of been suspicious about how much information the government really has. But in recent days, I've really kind of begun to look at this and kind of think, okay, maybe they actually do have more than I suspected, because I'd long suspected that, again, U.S. intelligence agencies certainly gathered information about UFOs, but based on what has been released through Freedom of Information Act over the years, it seems to strongly support kind of what we're already talking about. Okay, something was seen in the sky. This is a potential threat. Let's examine this. What did they say? They couldn't identify it. Was it a Russian, fighter jet? Was it Chinese? No. Okay, somebody saw some lights. Was a missile fired? No. Okay, case closed. File a Service report. Send it to NORAD. Nobody will ever see it again. I began to get the impression that, again, the government looks at these things when and if they think there's a potential threat. And when they find no evidence of one, they move along. They're like, we can't keep all these files. But in recent days, not only with the forthcoming, UAP task force report and what people are hoping to see, but leading up to that, Senator Marco Rubio, now vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. We've also got the former
which is kind of an oxymoron for him, but
what do you mean? What? Say that? What?
We don't get into politics here. I just sorry.
Politics free zone. For former director of national intelligence, Ratcliffe, also, speaking about some of the things that he has seen, he makes references to satellite data, multi-sensor data, which seems to support observations and intelligence, maybe that instrumental data, even that the government has obtained related to purported UAP. So again, that's interesting to me. And then the really interesting part too has been, in addition to what certain people who are in the know have said that they have seen, which has led them to try and make a push for the release of some of that information to the public, we also see in recent reporting by Brian Bender over at Politico, the fact that the UAP task force seems to have indicated that they are concerned that certain intelligence agencies are sort of stiff-arming them. In other words, they are doing one of two things: trying to backpedal on information that they will release to the UAP task force, and or are almost ignoring the fact that the investigation is underway and they don't want to give up the information that they have.
And there may be some credence to that. There's no consistency between, say, what the Navy has, yet what the Air Force folks might have.
Well, yeah, and again, the curious absence of the Navy and their involvement. Oh, I'm sorry, not the Navy. The Navy's been very involved in recent years, but the curious absence of the U.S. Air Force with its involvement in the UAP question. Tyler Rogaway over at the War Zone has, which my friend Brett Tingley, who I mentioned earlier, writes for. The guys over at the War Zone do a fantastic job looking at this, especially from a defense angle. And Ty has repeatedly tried to get statements from the U.S. Air Force on all this, and they will not talk about it. Although I can't say that's much different from my experience trying to get NASA and the FAA to comment on the issue. These agencies don't want and will not comment on this, but there certainly seems to be an emerging narrative that the data that has been collected for no doubt for years, whatever significance it has to intelligence agencies, they don't seem to want to give it up. And if you think back to the famous, there was a court case a number of years ago where, oh gosh, and I'm just now suddenly drawing a blank on his name. One of you guys will know, but the attorney Gersten, who had been appealing this case with regard to the NSA and its UFO documentation. It ended up going to court, and the district judge ended up actually being made privy to what data the NSA said, we do not want to release this to the public in the interest of national security.
And after he read it, he agreed with them.
He did. He agreed, and he said, "Okay, yep, I think we're going to have to rule in favor of the NSA. This information won't be released." Subsequent attempts to get those files from the NSA by John Greenwald or the Black Vault have turned up that the NSA now says those documents don't exist.
Yeah,
Right.
that's always what
the whole
happens.
Citizens Against UFO Secrecy movement.
That was
You
it.
know,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
got a ton of. I mean, it got a ton of momentum, and I think everybody was a little bit flabbergasted when all of a sudden, boom. I mean, because there was just a lot. There was just a lot of support. I mean, you had the momentum building. You had credible people. The case seemed to be. I mean, good Lord, Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. I mean, what the heck?
Well, yeah. And, you think about the work of researchers like Barry Greenwood and others with Just Cause and everything. And, a fantastic book that Barry wrote, co-authored with Lawrence Fawcett, which was originally called Clear Intent. But
Clear
then
Intent. Yeah.
and it was republished as the UFO cover-up because their contention at that time was that, yes, there was information the U.S. government would not release about this subject. So it's not like what we're seeing right now is anything new, but I think it's taken on I think that the picture has become much sharper. And, for me recently, that yes, the intelligence agencies do collect information about this subject. For whatever reason, they will not release it. I don't know that it is necessarily a grand, dark cover-up because we know apparently that they have the information.
It might just be their compartmentalized clearances.
Could be, but
The left hand never knows what the right hand is doing.
But I am troubled by the fact that when the Navy, designates under the cognizance of the Department of the Navy a task force to address this issue, and they request all this data from other branches of government, and they will not give it. They won't even acknowledge the operations of said task force. I mean, this really does start to kind of cause you to wonder who is really running our government. How bureaucratic is this?
A retired buddy of mine who was in the Navy for many, many years. He was just in the neighborhood, and he and I just randomly found ourselves getting on a Southwest flight, and he saw that I was I was on my iPad coast to coast, I was, downloading books, stuff like that, and he and I just started talking about stuff, and he says we don't all talk to each other the way you might think we do. And I looked at him like, like he was kind of like over, kind of like, looking at my, my screen and stuff. I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "We seem to be interested in those flying objects out there." Because I was playing the, the Go Fast video, and I didn't even know she was looking at me because we just happened to run into each other at the Southwest Airport. We just happened to get on the same flight to Southern California, and he says, we don't all talk the way we should, and the other branches should share more than they do with us because we're the ones. Gotta love these Navy guys. Like, we're the ones keeping America safe. I'm sure if I talked to an Air Force guy, he'd say that. If I talked to an Army guy, he'd say that. But I always found it pretty fascinating that he made that little flippant comment to me on the plane that one time.
That is fascinating. I remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan in his book Secrecy.
Great book.
Yes, and it's one that, it's not directly relevant to UFOs, but I recommend that people read that if they want to have an idea of government secrecy and the reasons for it, and even what I would call noble secrecy. Richard Dolan and I have had this conversation several times. This idea that the government is just withholding information from us just for the sake of withholding information from us. That's not necessarily the case. Kind of coming back to what you said, Gil, there may be reasons for compartmentalization and certainly reasons for national security that information.
Sure. And we don't have a need to know in their eyes.
We don't have a need to know, and other agencies don't have a need to know either.
Right.
But the problem was, as outlined by Moynihan, had, for instance, immediately prior to 9/11, these agencies shared some of the intelligence that they had at that time, we might have prevented the greatest terrorist act on U.S. soil, and the loss of life comparable prior to the pandemic we're currently in. It was only comparable to Pearl Harbor. So he did make the case that maybe a little less secrecy, at least between intra-agency communications, would be
certainly helpful. If those agencies had a database of like MUFON, so that they could keep a record of who, what, when, where, all the important, data points, I think it would be really helpful, but that's not how secrecy works. That's not how need to know works. So I think, when people call NASA never a straight answer and things like that, you can extend that to the intelligence community as well.
What is your feeling and analysis related to the number one word that comes out of Richard Dolan's, almost every other sentence? I love Richard. I watch him all the time, but, disclosure. Disclosure. Well, what is your reaction when you hear that word and your viewpoint on on folks's I don't know, this waiting for I don't know what's going to happen. Alien walks out on the lawn with the president. I don't know. Why do you feel about that word?
People keep saying if UFOs exist, why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well,
they almost
did.
have a couple times, but
they did. Story. Yeah, I mean, in 1952, there's film of them flying over the Capitol building.
Well, I could also say, to use the tired old anthill analogy, which I get really kind of tired of every person who ever brings this up using, but I'm gonna do the exact same redundant thing and do it. It's kind of like saying, why don't I ever go over there and park my car next to the anthill and try to communicate with the ants?
Mm-hmm.
If this is some sort of exotic technology, which is being controlled by an equally exotic intelligence, why would they necessarily feel it necessary to say, gosh, we're gonna have to go have lunch with them? I mean,
yeah,
they may think of us as so insignificant. They could be here very covertly mining material resources from parts of Earth in a way that is not going to greatly deplenish our resources, but which assists them in some way. They could be here observing as scientists, as a sort of zoo hypothesis kind of thing. They could be here doing any number of things. They could be taking refuge here. They could be escapees from some sort of intergalactic penal colony who are
as long as we're speculating, yeah, it could be anything.
I mean, they could have any reason for being here, all of which we could incorporate an idea as to why they actually might consider it in their best interest to have as little contact with humans as possible. And everything in the literature, barring alien abduction claims, seems to strongly suggest that. You think about the Stefan Michalak case, from back in the 70s up there in Canada, where he's talking and the door is open on the craft and he hears talking and he thinks there must be a couple of Americans in there and they're having some problem with their craft. Hey, and he says, you Yankee boys, you guys, are you in trouble? And the minute he yells, he says that they just shut up. They were like, and he never saw them, but he heard the talking and they shut up the minute they hear him talking. And I'm thinking, whoever was in there, what's going through their mind? Oh, great. Who's this? Close the door, take off, and he gets blasted yet again, unintentional, harmful effect from near proximity
with the blast on his chest.
Right. And yet again, coming back to my earlier point about how the skeptics have said, show us good evidence, and we'll be the first ones to say you've got something. And then we get the Navy videos. They're like, peanut dangling from monofilament. Yeah. Well, with Michalak, there have been skeptics who have tried to say he injured himself as part of the hoax. And I'm like, same thing with Betty Cash. I saw a skeptic argue that Betty Cash had maybe drank. Now, he had nothing to back this claim up whatsoever. It was pure conjecture. Mm-hmm. But he tried to argue that she had drank some sort of cleaning fluid to injure herself to try and get money from the U.S. Air Force.
Which, of course, also induced radiation poisoning.
Exactly. And I'm thinking burns on her skin, hair falling out, all that from drinking, detergent or something. And I'm like, where is the evidence? But see, the skeptic in these cases, not all skeptics do this. There are some great skeptics, but I'm saying when the skeptic offers a conclusion for which they have no supporting evidence, just because in their mind it is a more tenable hypothesis than alien visitation, doesn't mean that their hypothesis is provable. Hello, right?
Yep.
So anyway, I could rant all night about that. But coming back to disclosure. Richard has for years, advanced that idea, as well as his co-author on one book, Bryce
Zabel.
Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, I worry about disclosure, and I'll tell you why, for two reasons. One, even in spite of the fact that we know that the government...
Project Bluebeam.
Right. Well, we know that there's information that intelligence agencies appear to be keeping on this subject. But my first question is, how likely is it that that information is going to be made available to the public? This forthcoming UAP task force, when we see how this shakes out, it's going to be a sort of a Rorschach test, because I think the disclosure people are like, here it comes, here it comes, here it comes. A lot of us are kind of sitting back more like this, just kind of kicking back and waiting and watching. But my predictions are A, there isn't probably going to be all that much released. B, it's probably going to take a whole lot longer than June 25th before we actually do see it. 3, that could be months or maybe years, but 4, there's a chance maybe that we won't ever see anything significant.
Mm-hmm.
And yet again, the Rorschach test, well, more than a Rorschach test, I think it's going to be like a thermometer. You're going to be able to test the temperature of government's attitude on this topic and the likelihood of disclosure. So
I have a, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I said I have a burning feeling that it's going to have all of the pomp, circumstance, arrival, and thud of the JFK release.
Well, think about how hopeful even J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée were in advance of the Condon Committee. Thank goodness we finally got scientists who are now assessing this problem. And if you read, for instance, in Forbidden Science, the journals of Jacques Vallée that he published, Jacques talking about how they were hopeful that the result of the forthcoming Condon Committee's report might lead to the establishment of an actual panel that investigates UFOs, officially. They were like, this is the best thing. My gosh, finally we've got scientists looking at this, and we very well may be on that panel. Hynek and I may be able to put together a task force and everything.
And then the low leak comes out, right?
What happens? Well, then the low leak comes out, and they realize, wait a minute, and then there are members of the committee who are retired, who are walking away from it, sort of in protest. Even prior to the Lowe memorandum. I mean, I think a year before the actual study was undertaken, Condon intimated something to the extent of,
I'm not supposed to come to that conclusion for another year.
Exactly. And it's like, in other words, you just told us exactly the conclusion you intend to come to, buddy. So, but again, to the real problems that we have and should be acknowledged about the Condon Committee report, I do see from time to time some skeptics say, look, they did a serious scientific analysis. Here's what they found, but that's not good enough for the ufologists. I'm like, anybody who really looks at the Condon Committee will see the tremendous trouble with biases. Yet again, talking the other day with Dr. David Clark, and David, very much a skeptic, not a debunker, but David says, I've got those same problems. He also thinks that there were tremendous biases. So again, look at how the scientific community had hoped for the outcome to be so positive. And what was the result? The media stopped paying attention to UFOs for decades. It ended up becoming water cooler, and you were made out to be crazy if you talked about it as a result of that report. Now, what happens, ladies and gents, if this UAP task force and its report has a similar effect and UFOs go back under the radar again for years after all the so-called progress we've been making? Not an impossible outcome. So about disclosure, I actually say we shouldn't put all of our hope in the expectation that government in any way at any time is going to be forthcoming with what it knows. I think that the effort of civilian researchers and scientists who are willing to look at the data, that's where we're going to be able to make progress. But I also think it's going to require scientists who are willing to, they're probably going to have to work pro bono.
Their reputations.
They're going to have to stake their reputation, but don't expect to get academic funding for this research for a while. It's going to have to be a side project, but that doesn't mean scientists can't start looking at it, and many are at this point. But that's going to happen. We're also going to have people get over this ridiculous fascination with what the government knows about UFOs. With all respect to everybody who's so interested in that, again, it frustrates me because, yeah, sure, they've got some stuff and it may be the best, but if there's not a good likelihood that we'll ever see it, shouldn't we be focusing on the data that we do have? Look at what Mark Roediger has just supplied David Marler with. He is sending the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies files out there to New Mexico so that Marler can bring Jan Aldrich and Barry Greenwood and others out there to scan these documents and make them available for research. Guys, we've got so much data about UFOs. I mean, I'm not saying I don't want to see what the government has. I just realize I have very measured expectations about whether we're likely to see that. And I think if we can be making progress right now, it's going to be with the data we already have. And
based on reports from people like Leah Haley and Mark Davenport, Carla Turner, the government or aspects of the government or aspects of the military seem to be very interested in what information they have. Right. That Leah Haley specifically, famously, was aboard a craft, she claims, that was shot down by an advanced EMP weapon by Eglin Air Force Base, and then she was she crawled out because this, craft had hit, the sand pretty hard. And she crawled out, and some military guy either yelled at her or through a megaphone told her, stay where you are, because she was really loopy, so she couldn't tell. And then, she had a MyLab. She was abducted by the military. They took her out on a little boat to a much bigger vessel, and they debriefed her pretty hard and wanted to know what the aliens aboard that craft wanted to know.
Yeah, that's a weird one too. I have to tell you, I've spoken to people who have seen UFOs over the years, and then they have experienced what they would liken to an abduction experience thereafter, where the abductors are humans. And when they come to and they're like, somebody asks them, what were those aliens? What was going on? Isn't that interesting? I mean, now I couldn't speak to the veracity of those stories, but I mean, I more than once have had people share that kind of story with me, talking about Whitley Strieber. That subject came up when he and I were talking years ago, and he said, Micah, I've had them come into my house. I mean, men who spoke English. So in his experience, he says that some of those experiences certainly were something other than alien. And so, I don't know exactly what that means, but I do feel like what that seems to indicate.
And he's not alone. There's several of those. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you think about the Frank Fontaine situation, which Jacques Vallée, in my opinion, gives one of the best overviews of that case in the book Revelations.
Mm-hmm.
This young man is going really quickly, because in the United States, this case maybe isn't as well known. And if I could, would that be okay if I quickly kind of summarize?
Sure, absolutely.
Frank Fontaine, and his friends, they were in their early 20s, and they're getting up at like 4:00 in the morning, and they live in this sort of apartment complex, which I believe the name of it was Purple Justice, right? And they're going out there to sell clothing at like a little market, and they get up to leave really early. And as they go down and the car is running, one of the friends goes back up inside to get something and everything, and Frank's out there, and there's a light that appears in the field, and a mist sort of enshrouds the vehicle. And when they come back out, they realize that Frank has vanished. They can't find him. Well, he's gone for a week, and it was a media sensation. And then all of a sudden, at yet again about 4 a.m., Frank shows up again at his apartment complex, knocking on the door, still in the same clothes that he'd vanished in. And his friends are like, "We thought you were dead." And well, later it's admitted that they were that it was all just a prank, and the story was kind of dropped thereafter. And so Jacques, as he's writing about it in Revelation, says, now, of course, if they admitted later that it was a hoax, why would I take interest in this case? Well, there had been French researchers, who had actually, looked at it themselves, and they'd spoken to Frank, and they were like, no one could account for where you were for a week, and you say that this is all just a hoax. And what he had told researchers was essentially, he's like, look, we didn't like all the press attention we were getting. And of course, they had also been like claiming that they were going to, see a UFO come down or something like that and everything, and that the press had hyped this, and there was all this stuff. And he says, well, we just didn't want anything to do with it, and so we just kind of got out of it. So the opinion of some of the French researchers that were looking at the case at that time had been that Frank Fontaine and his friends come out and say that it was a hoax just to get people off their back, but that something, whatever it was, had really happened. Well, Vallée claims that he had spoken to a French Air Force official who had said, yes, Mr. Fontaine was taken. Yes, our people had something to do with this. And yes, what Frank had claimed he remembered was being in a room with like equipment. And he said that when he would come to very, slowly and open his eyes, he remembered seeing like shelving that he could see, and he would only come to for very short periods and then he'd black out again. But he said that periodically over several days, he seemed to kind of wake up in some sort of room with machinery. As Vallée is told, this Air Force guy says, yes, we were sort of gauging public attitudes about that case. And yes, there was certainly a psychological aspect of what was going on there. And at one point, Vallée, who will not publish this official's name, but he says that he asked him, what are you going to do? What's to stop me from going and writing about this? And the military official essentially says to him, it doesn't matter if you go and publish this. No one will believe it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, Vallée seems to make if nothing else, we can say it's a really interesting story, but I don't see why Vallée or anybody else would, make that up. I mean, he seems to describe something very natural, not extraterrestrial at all, but which did account for where this young man went and why he vanished. And he further says, and this is very interesting, Vallée said certain aspects of Fontaine's disappearance were very much like and reminiscent of the Travis
Walton.
Yeah. I've always been intrigued by that. Is there a story behind the story? People always want to talk about the aliens that Travis saw, and I'm not disputing that he saw some, but if you recall, the majority of the individuals that he had interactions with during that experience, with the exception of right there at the beginning where he said that there were little people, little, alien type people, but most of the individuals that he said he saw during that experience, he said they look like humans, the epitome of their gender, right? With these helmets on, he said they're people. And
also with the Travis Walton case, I think it's important to remember that, he jumped out of the truck, went, almost directly underneath the saucer, and was hit with this beam that, his crew thought killed him. And, he thinks today, anyway, I don't know how long he's thought this, but he thinks today that the reason he was gone so long is that they were healing him. They were working on him, to repair whatever damage that might have been done by the beam or what happened to him after that. So, I mean, it's a lot of different aspects, on that case.
Oh yeah. It's definitely more complex and dynamic than a lot of popular retellings of the story.
And I wanted to ask you, Micah, we usually go from 7 to 9, but we definitely can and will go longer if the guest is up for it. And I wanted to ask you, are you up for longer, or can we rapid fire questions?
I could go a little bit longer than 10 Eastern, 9 Central, but not too much longer.
Okay.
Because unfortunately, I do have some obligations. But yes, I'll try and stretch it the best I can.
So let's go ahead.
I've got to peel out I have a 7 o'clock interview that I got to do with a tax client.
Fair enough.
In 15 minutes. I'm a tax guy, by the way, Mr. Hanks.
I see. Well, it's that time of the year, so maybe we should do rapid questions, or I'll come back at some point too, and we can do this again because it's always fun.
That sounds great.
Yeah,
I love it.
Anytime.
So along with UFOs, there are a lot of accompanying high strangeness cases like Men in Black, crop circles, Bigfoot, poltergeist-like phenomena, and other associated weirdness. In relation to the study of UFOs, are these other aspects worthwhile or worthless? To what degree do you think that witnesses contribute to what they see?
Well, witnesses certainly contribute to what they see, because everything that we are discussing here has to do with and is contingent upon, the observer. It's people's testimony. Now, in terms of high strangeness things associated with UFOs, I've got a lot of wonderful friends, and many of them who've got a lot more credentials behind their name than I do, who will look at these stories and be like, man, it's undeniable there's a high strangeness element, and all this stuff's connected. And I'm like, well, but you got to remember, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Just because people, for instance, if you look at distribution maps that show the areas where sightings of Sasquatch and UFOs are most prevalent, they do tend to generally overlap. And in fact,
you just hit my next question.
Yeah, they do tend to actually overlap. But the problem is that
you've got your Bigfoot and my UFO. You got your UFO and my Bigfoot.
There was a case that Stan Gordon investigated a number of years ago, where there had been a lot of sightings of Sasquatch, around the time UFOs were observed. And in one particular incident, people had said that they'd seen a UFO over a field and some large kind of shadowy, almost ape-like looking kind of entities. But I don't know that necessarily means that UFOs and Sasquatch are somehow related to one another. And as far as the distribution maps, in my opinion, what that really says a whole lot about is where there are a lot of people in the world. And those maps show, again, I bet you if you showed population density in relation to those other demographics, sightings of UFO and Sasquatch, you're going to find population centers there too. In other words, where there's a lot of people, that's where you're going to have people saying that they're seeing those things. So I don't know that there's a correlation. There's certainly a pattern that appears to emerge, but I don't think that there's a causal correlation there by any means.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, it kind of goes into my next question that while the Bigfoot researchers want to keep the UFO cases out of their studies and the UFO researchers want to keep Bigfoot out of their studies, there are many cases in which UFO sightings are often followed up by Bigfoot sightings, not only on the same night, but sometimes within the same hour, sometimes seen by the same witnesses. What do you think the connection is? Are they just letting the dog out to go walksies while they're here?
I wondered about it, but I mean, you know, in my opinion, I couldn't tell you why or if there's a connection. I spoke to a gentleman named Stacy. Oh gosh, yet again, I'm blanking on all my names tonight. But anyway, long story short, he had told me a story about research that he's done where he looks for purported Sasquatch type creatures. And Stacy Brown, I don't know where my names are going. This has always been a thing for me.
That's a lot faster than I usually remember things.
Dates and numbers and stuff and details I can remember, but God, I don't know what it is. It's always been a thing for me with names. But anyway, so Stacy Brown, we talked about his skunk ape research, and he had said that that sightings of Earthlight type things turn up where people say that they see these creatures. Now, again, to me, that's interesting. I've also talked with some of the members of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy who have told one at least very abduction-like story where a light was seen in the woods, and some of the guys don't recall, what happened after this light appeared. But again, there was no sighting of a Sasquatch. Yet I've heard people who have also heard that story go, "See, I'm telling you, I knew there was a connection. It's undeniable." And I'm like, well, but just because some Sasquatch researchers were out and some of them saw a light, but they saw no Bigfoot the same night. Just because the Sasquatch guys saw a UFO or something that they might have interpreted as being one does not mean that there's necessarily a connection between that light that they think they might have seen and the Sasquatch. You see, So again, to my way, and actually, again, I would say that most of the NOAC guys I'm talking about who have told that story in various instances, they would probably say the same thing. I mean, there's no correlation necessarily between that light and the thing we were out there looking for. So I couldn't tell you as far as what that connection might be or if there is one. But the way I look at it is that, you go looking for strange stuff, you're very likely to see it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're all coming from the same place.
That's true. That's true. So let's get into Bigfoot. I used to own a copy of John Napier's book, Bigfoot, the Yeti, and Sasquatch in Myth and Reality. And it seemed like a well-informed, well-researched book to me as a kid, and the upshot was that one probably existed and the other probably not. What makes that book a foundational text?
That's a good question. I think it's a foundational text because if you look at the other work that Napier did, having co-authored papers with the Leakeys, about some of the early hominins that had been observed in Africa and whatnot. Yet again, foundational work in anthropology, in mainstream anthropology. His background and the fact that he was more skeptical in a lot of ways than the average Bigfoot researcher, that absolutely made, in my opinion, what Napier did, very, very important reading for all people who look at this topic. Now, the other thing too that I think that one has to take into consideration when they read Napier's book, that was the only book he ever wrote about Bigfoot, although there are videos that have turned up online in recent years where Napier is interviewing Ivan Sanderson and having a conversation about
Bigfoot. Wow.
Yeah, which I'd be happy to share because it's on YouTube. I don't remember the channel that has that, nor did I know it existed prior to having recently seen that appear online. But seeing these two giants, one more skeptically inclined than a traditional anthropologist, Sanderson being a trained zoologist himself, who had written a lot of books. I've got a great book by him over there called Animal Tales. He wrote all kinds of books about his interest in animals as a zoologist that had nothing to do with his interest in Sasquatch, but he also was very open-minded, and he definitely had something of a flair for the dramatic, and he was even chattier than I am in his writing. So, I mean, but the thing about Napier is that unlike a lot of researchers from that time, he definitely was a little more cautious than they were, and yet he still came to this conclusion in that book. I don't know about the abominable snowman, but I think that there must be something out there leaving giant footprints in North America. Yeah. Now, what's interesting to me is that I think a lot of the data that he looked at in support of the North American Sasquatch did not come to light as being probably hoax, data until decades after he wrote that book, even though some of the suspicions, I mean, yes, I'm talking about the Ray Wallace hoaxes in Bluff Creek, California, There had been suspicions about that as early as the 1960s. In fact, in a letter between Greg Agogino and not Greg Agogino, George Agogino, who wrote the foreword for the original book that Sanderson wrote, which I guess was first published in 61, Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life. I don't think that later editions had it, but in the original, Agogino writes, yet again, a traditional anthropologist, very much so, right? Not a crazy cryptid hunter or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
He, in a letter with Sanderson, had expressed concerns, and Sanderson had been expressing them to Agogino, that there had been a woman who had written to him from California. She ran a little hotel, and she said that Ray Wallace and his brothers had stayed at her hotel one season, and she said that they would sit out there on the front porch, which was right next to the office, drinking beer. And that she had heard them all laughing about this prank with the footprints, and they talked about how they'd done it and everything, and how they carried it out. So Sanderson had gotten an inkling of an idea it was a hoax that early on. Many other people had heard whispers too, but Napier never touches on that point, to my knowledge. I don't know that he necessarily wholeheartedly endorses Ray Wallace either, but the point I'm making is that the Wallace family wouldn't come out until the early 2000s and say, "Yeah, guys, that was a hoax." And so, while he was saying there must be something out there leaving footprints, well, some of that data has been called into question. I still think that there is probably a physical creature that matches the descriptions that are in the better cases, and possibly in the footage from 1967 captured by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, that actually represents this species. But I wouldn't rule out as quickly as Napier did the abominable snowman. There have been some remarkable observations by scientists in that region of the world too that seem to describe a similar kind of a creature, which I would like to call a relict hominoid, rather than relic hominid. And it's a it's a fascinating mystery to me. But again, people are like, how could you believe in Bigfoot? Those things are a mythical creature. I'm like, look, if you look at the paleoanthropological record, as recently as at least maybe 45,000 years ago, Earth was shared by modern Homo sapiens sapiens and Neanderthals. Around that time, or a little further back, we also had the Denisovans. We had on the island of Flores, of course, Homo floresiensis, which may have been related to the Denisovans. Some also think that they may have had relationship to Homo erectus even. But we go even further back, and we've got even better qualifiers like Paranthropus, which at times there's been some debate about their height and their overall size, but some
Australopithecus.
The Australopithecines, yes, again, and perhaps the best of them all, although it was, there's debate also about what this creature looked like, but Gigantopithecus in Asia. We only know it from jaw fragments and teeth that have been found in Chinese apothecary shops, and also recovered from caves thereafter. But Gigantopithecus was quite obviously a very large ape. It had always been Grover Kranz's contention that based on the shape of the jaw, it would have made room for the trachea, and thereby strongly seemed to imply a bipedal structure based on his study of primate anatomy. So if we're talking about a 10-foot tall, potentially bipedal ape from parts of Asia, I mean, that sounds an awful lot to me like Sasquatch.
It does.
It does. So, I mean, these creatures, that's not a myth. That's not a legend. That's in the actual fossil record. And to say that such creatures have never existed is simply wrong. Now, the question of whether they still exist is indeed something that has yet to be determined.
So we've got the anthropological perspective. What's your opinion regarding paranormal Bigfoot?
I mean, I'm always open-minded to any possibility, but the issue I have with that is that if we can't explain what a paranormal Bigfoot is, then we can't use that as an explanation for Bigfoot. And that's the issue I take. I've got a lot of friends, and again, I'll name a friend here too, because he's not shy at all about his more paranormal interpretations. But my good pal, Nick Redfern, he says that, look, there are too many factors in these observer situations where people will see the things do strange things, or if they see them vanish into thin air. And he says to say that these things are simply flesh and blood just does not meet all of the criteria based on eyewitness descriptions. And, and so he says, I'm very comfortable saying that there's a paranormal aspect to Bigfoot, but I also think that Nick doesn't get too far out there like a lot of researchers tend to do. I mean, Bigfoot's jumping through portals and interdimensionals and things like this. Nick actually has, in a lot of descriptions he gives of that idea and his version of it, he kind of pairs it back and says, maybe something about the way that Sasquatch is able to behave is essentially paranormal. In other words, it may have a completely, and I'm paraphrasing, so I don't want to be putting any words in his mouth, but my understanding of how he words this is that maybe they are able to do something that we don't understand, which has a basis in biology, but that whatever that misunderstood faculty they possess, if it's a pheromone they release or it's some other kind of a natural camouflage.
Infrasound, yeah.
For some, it may indeed seem unexplained because we haven't explained it yet, but it might account for some of the weirdness that people associate with those sightings. Now, that to me actually is perfectly tenable, but it really comes down to what we mean by paranormal. So I like what Nick proposes in those instances, but some of the paranormalists go way out there and they don't seem to say, well, can we offer something that, like what Nick does, helps us maybe explain certain aspects of the witness experience. Rather, some of the paranormalists simply seem to want to say, well, we can't catch these things, therefore they are interdimensional. That's not an explanation. So I'm willing to entertain hypotheses if they help advance our potential knowledge and aren't too speculative. But for me personally, the best way that we can advance our knowledge about this subject is to deal with it as a matter of serious paleoanthropology, serious primate anatomy. Let's deal with that first and see if we can solve it on those terms before we start going to more, far out theories.
Speaking of far out theories, regarding Charles Fort and pre-ufology, was Fort writing for himself to gaslight others, or was he actually researching true unexplained phenomena, perhaps with a little artistic license?
Charles Fort, I love Fort's.
And again, remember, we're in the rapid phase, rapid fire phase here.
Yeah, sure. I think he was writing for himself. But I also think, because what's interesting about the era in which Fort was writing is that there hadn't been a whole lot of people who had done it like he did and tried to systematize it, right? So I think that Fort was doing something that was a unique hobby of his, but he obviously also liked taking those jabs at science. And the early reviewers of his work were not always kind to Fort. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, some of them were very dismissive of it. But I do think that, if he didn't love what he was doing, he wouldn't have continued after some of those reviews. And he went on for several more books, right? So he must have liked what he did to some degree.
Yep. So, Micah, where can people find more about you? And where can we go to find more of your stuff, like your books, your podcasts, and so on?
Yeah, everything is at micahhanks.com. I'm actually involved in a lot of different stuff right now. MicahHanks.com is where you'll find everything essentially that I'm doing. But a couple of other projects include Sasquatch Tracks, which is a podcast I'm doing.
Just listened to the episode the other day.
Yeah, people like that show a lot. I mean, my flagship, the most popular show by far, which covers the widest range of topics, is just the Micah Hanks program. You can find the Micah Hanks program at micahhanks.com/podcast. But if you're there at the website, I do have links to all the other shows I do. And the next one that's quickly making its way up the ladder is Sasquatch Tracks, that my colleagues Jeff and Dakota do with me. People like it because we do try to get mostly either serious researchers who are, real outdoor type people who are out there. Most of them are trained naturalists, but we also do have a lot of, scientists, historical researchers, and others who come on the show, and we really seriously talk about it. It's not campfire stories. I got a 1-star review on my other show the other day for using that term. They said, "What's wrong with campfire stories? I ain't never listening to your ass again," but I have to point out, if we really want to understand this phenomena, stories are great and they can be helpful, but we also need to try and apply science toward this too.
Oh, without a doubt. So if we can briefly touch on anomalous phenomena, William Corliss and the Fortean legacy, what would you have to say about that in, say, 2 minutes?
2 minutes, I would say this. First, a lot of people don't know who William Corliss was. He was an American physicist who, in a very single-minded fashion, and I mean that in a good way, he collected data, but he took what Charles Fort started doing, and he did it in a slightly more scientifically inclined and certainly documented it a little better than Fort had done. And that's what he did. He collected data on everything in nature that was anomalous, because he thought anomalous data, may help us expand our knowledge of the universe and even shatter paradigms. I wish more people would do that today. And I think that really there should be serious efforts to try and follow in the footsteps of both Fort, but also more importantly, guys like Corliss, who tried to kind of refine Fort's approach and make it more scientific. I'd love to see more people looking at anomalous data like that today.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Micah, I really appreciate you being here with us on Into the Fringe. It's been an absolute honor and delight to have you here, and I do hope that we can see you again soon.
I would look forward to that. Let's definitely do it again. This is a great conversation. You guys both asked great questions, and again, like you mentioned, it's been a long time coming, Gil.
Yeah. I'm glad we finally got it going. And just for the audience, next week we will have author, researcher, and former intelligence officer Walter Bosley on Into the Fringe. So tune in and don't miss that.
Yeah, he's another good pal. Great guy.
And I guess that'll do it for Into the Fringe for tonight. So again, Micah Hanks, thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, and good luck with Bosley. He's quite a knowledgeable gentleman.
He is
one of my favorites.
His books are incredible.
Fantastic. So, but listen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and
thank you.
I look forward to the next one. Okay.
All right. We'll see you then.
Take care.